Hi there. Here we go on another Wednesday Bible study. We are doing, again, continuing our systematic theology on eschatology, that is the study of end times. And last week, I kind of introduced it. We talked about more or less the bare minimum of things that we know for sure about the end. And I kind of gave a general overview of that. So this week we would look at the Olivet Discourse of Jesus. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're not going to even get through it because there's a lot. There's just a whole lot to say, to be honest with you. Kind of think this eschatology thing might take a little bit of time. So we'll just start with the Olivet Discourse today and see where we get. So what we would like to know is this. What did Jesus say himself about the end times while he was with his disciples? Most pointed teaching he gives is what we call the Olivet Discourse. It's called that because they went to the Mount of Olives with the disciples, and there he taught them this very thing. So we're going to look at the discourse of that in three gospel accounts. Today we're going to concentrate on what's in Matthew's account and attempt to understand the Olivet Discourse first on its own terms, which the problem with understanding anything in the Scripture is sometimes we want to look at the Scripture and immediately put it in our context and put it in some kind of application form to what's around us in the here and now. That's just a terrible way to do that. It's irresponsible hermeneutics. The text that we read was given in a time and place to a specific context for a specific reason. And until we understand that, we won't understand the rest of it. So most people do not do that with eschatology. They simply run straight to ideas. And so we're going to kind of break down the Olivet Discourse in terms of what it meant in its context. And then we'll talk about how people have interpreted it by an influence of maybe their own eschatological view over time. So let's start with this. What brought the discourse about? What started Jesus to teach the Olivet Discourse? Well, it's the week of the Passion, and Jesus is in Jerusalem with the disciples, and it's likely Tuesday of that Passion week. Jesus has been scalding Jewish leaders that week about their dead religion. This is the first clue as to how to interpret the Olivet Discourse, is because it comes within the context of this idea that Jesus is warning the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, the temple priests, everyone, that they are in a dead religion. So the religion aspect, being called a Jew, having a temple to begin with, having some system, having this city, Jerusalem, they thought so highly about. God is about to bring judgment upon those who have put their faith in these things, in their DNA and everything else, rather than in God and in the coming Christ, who there he is before them and they don't understand. This is really important, and here's why. If these Jewish leaders saw their own Messiah and did not recognize him, they did not have any idea what their religion was actually about. And that's really at the heart of the Olivet Discourse. Jesus has already been, when we get to the Olivet Discourse, he's already cursed the fig tree not long before he goes into the discourse. And we see that actually before Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse in Mark 11, when it says, on the following day, when they came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season of the figs. When he said, may no one ever eat fruit from you again, and then his disciples heard it. So the fig tree was leaved out. So it would have been a little early here for fig trees to leave out. And one of the things you would see, if a fig tree actually was leaved out, it would also have buds on it, okay? That would obviously make figs. We should know that because we have fig trees as well. But there are no figs. There obviously aren't any buds either. Now, you could actually eat the buds, and they would often do that. So the point, though, is not that the tree itself or the timing or anything else. Jesus is using this as a metaphor all the dead religious systems of Judaism, they were failing to produce righteousness, they were failing to produce mercy, they were not salt and light, and so Jesus says, may nobody ever eat from you again. In this sense, he is damning not all the Jews, but this dead religion that the leaders had led them to, okay? And Jesus says this, and he says it's now ending. This part of redemptive history is over. It's not bearing fruit. And so that's what he means by that. Again, this is not an indicative that no Jews are going to be ever saved or anything like that. It simply means that there's now a time where in this old dead system and all these rituals were coming to an end, and they would never be active again. Second, and also in this context, we see in Matthew 23, Jesus is warning against outward religious signs that have no true meaning. This is the chapter right before the Olivet Discourse in Matthew. And Matthew 23, beginning in verse 5, he says, they do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts, and have the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplace, being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And no man, your father, shall you call on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So the position, the show, the desiring of honor, it was all nonsense, and Jesus condemns it harshly. This is a real issue among the leadership, but remember, just a reminder, even those Jews who were not part of the leadership were complicit here because they fell right in with it. They were all having then the same problem to a greater degree than others would have been leaders. Of course, and Jesus is usually speaking to leaders when he does this, because at all times leaders have more of culpability, if you will. But they were all complicit. They all fell into this. They may not have been as guilty but they were guilty enough. Think about the Wailing Wall today in Jerusalem. Now, when the temple was sacked and it was torn to pieces, actually it's burned, and the stones overturned. The reason they overturned the stones, they pried them apart, was because the fire melted gold. And so the Romans took all these stones apart to get to all the gold. And we know that from archaeological digs. So this is what brings about this whole discourse. We start to read that in Matthew 24, verse 1. And going back to just the idea of the Wailing Wall, I didn't finish that thought. It's really important to think about it. Sometimes people see that as some great spiritual thing. The Wailing Wall wasn't part of the temple complex. It was an outer wall. It was left because it didn't really have any value in terms of turning over the temple and taking what was valuable. Everything was gone. The only thing left that was close to the temple was that part of that outer wall. And so when we think about the Wailing Wall today, we see people going on, they almost go on these pilgrimages to Jerusalem, which sounds more like an Islamic thing than a Christian thing, to be honest with you. And they go to this site, and they go to the Wailing Wall, and they put their little prayers in the wall. And my question would be this. First of all, why would those prayers be more special than the prayer you can say sitting in your chair at home? They wouldn't. In fact, in a sense, if we go back and we try to start prying up buildings and prying up relics again, we almost become complicit with the same thing they had fallen into. So when we see Hasidic Jews still over there today with their phylacteries and they're wailing at that wall, that this is actually something that Jesus points to. And basically says, you like to be heard in your prayers. It's a religious thing. Without Christ, without them understanding their Messiah and why they don't need a temple anymore, their wails are absolutely useless. They're noise to God because they are not recognizing God himself in Christ. And so that's really important that we see that. So this brings us about to the Olivet Discourse, beginning in chapter 24, verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away. The disciples came to point out to the buildings of the temple, and he answered and said, "You see these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be one stone left on another. They will all be thrown down." Now, from Mark's gospel, we understand that, and Luke's as well, that the disciples are pointing out how impressive this building is to Jesus, or to them. And so they're pointing out how beautiful these large, huge stones were and things of that nature. And Jesus makes it very clear. He mentions no words about saying, "Hey, don't worry about this building. It's going to be gone." Okay, and it certainly is today and will be forever. So when we see that, we see this idea, there will be not one stone left on another. But think about this. Why the temple? Why would that still have been so important? And how did this impact the disciples when they hear Jesus say this? Remember, Jesus is predicting what's going to happen in AD 70 when Rome takes the temple apart. But why allow that? And this is what the disciples may be thinking in their minds. Wait a minute here, the temple's going to be gone? What do you mean? I don't understand. This is exactly what they would have been thinking. The temple was two things intentionally, okay? One of them is this. The temple was an intentional design of God in every sense of the word to call the nations to himself as a refuge. Himself as a refuge. The attraction was magnificent. The gold was amazing, hard to look upon in the daylight. Okay? And so it was a beautiful sight. And it was to call people to God. It was call the nations together and to worship him. To be a house of prayer, he says, for the nations is what Jesus talks about, right? And so this is what the temple was for. It was enormous and glorious sight, and it's a picture of God's people and his kingdom worshiping together, praying together, singing together. A picture of the kingdom, the larger picture of the kingdom you find there. The temple was also wherein the mercy seat, of course, lied. And so the place of forgiveness coming from the ordained sacrifice of God was seen there. The sacrifice was simply, though, a placeholder, a foreshadow of Christ and his laying down his life, his shedding his blood. Therefore, it was temporary. So Jesus was about to make it permanently fulfilled. Why? Because he's going to be the final sacrifice. He's going to bring together the idea of the kingdom. Remember this picture of Jesus coming. John the Baptist said the kingdom is at hand. Right here it is. It's coming with him. And so because of that, now that temple doesn't have any reason to even exist. Because it's fulfilled in Christ in every sense of the word, and it's fulfilled as the gospel goes out from Jerusalem to the nations wherein the kingdom is built. And so because of these things, it was no longer needed. It's unnecessary in every sense of the word. Now for Jews, they would have wailed and mourned greatly initially because that meant no sacrifices. If there's no temple, there's no way to sacrifice. Therefore, how would they have forgiveness of sins? Well, they developed this idea of almsgiving as the way to do that. Just be a good Jew, give your alms, and that is now how. And they're awaiting some Messiah to come restore things. And the problem is they're awaiting a Messiah that's already come. And when he's coming back, it will be for a different reason. So that's just a little bit of what he's been saying here. But for the Jews, the temple was certainly a stumbling block. It became their hope. The temple itself was their hope, rather than the Christ who was coming to fulfill the reason for the temple and usher in the kingdom. That's why they missed out on who Jesus was. And we see that in the scriptures. If they'd known, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. And so all this then became stumbling blocks of religion, and they were all removed, and Jesus fulfilled that. Now who's the stumbling block? Jesus himself, for those who won't come to him. So he's going to remove all these things, and it'll just be himself. much like when we see the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus is atop the mountain with his three closest disciples, and he's transformed into his glorious state there. And of course Moses and Elijah appear, and so as they talk, the disciples are like, hey, let's build places for them right up here on this mountain. And all of a sudden they go away, and it's only Jesus sitting here. And the reason is because, forget all that, everything was about him. And so we see Jesus calling that truth out in the Olivet Discourse. Now we start to see how more we should interpret the Olivet Discourse. All that is context for us. If we understand that right there, now we can understand more about how to interpret the Olivet Discourse and then interpret everything about eschatology. And it all comes from that one context, okay? So now he begins the actual Olivet Discourse in chapter 24, verse 3. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will all these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answers them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. And these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Think about the way the disciples were puzzled here at the time of this religious context that we've described. How could it be that the temple would be gone, that the whole religious system would collapse? The land was not really in the control of the Jews anymore. Now the temple would be gone. Now the sacrifice, the priesthood would be made useless. And so there was no reason for the Levitical priests anymore if there was no sacrifice. Of course, the disciples were bewildered, and it was jarring for them to hear. So that's where Jesus starts teaching here. He lays out not only an answer for them, like how will we know this is going to happen? What are you talking about? He gives a specific answer about things. And remember, this is all signs about the temple itself being destroyed. That's another thing we got to remember when interpreting this. Incidentally, and in order to interpret this in an honest way, we have to interpret it first with that in mind, the destruction of the temple. So before the temple would be destroyed in AD 70, these things would happen. And that's what Jesus literally says. These will happen before the temple is destroyed. And that is what happened. So Josephus was a reliable Jewish historian who recorded these events that took place between Jesus saying these things and between AD 70. Indeed, even the scriptures themselves attest to a great earthquake that happened when Jesus is crucified. And so, of course, beyond that, we know this for a fact, throughout all of history since the time of the Olivet Discourse, there has been an incredible amount of natural disaster throughout the world that have produced untold human suffering. Sometimes disasters in very close proximity to time, but those things seem to be cyclical. They seem to happen in places and times, and even if it looked like it was amped up at this time, maybe there's a time where it doesn't look so much that way. Now there's more, and people start getting excited, and then it's not. Jesus doesn't even say those are birth pains. He says it's beginning of birth pains. It's not even like labor pains yet. That's how early it is. So he's telling us, remember when we have these natural disasters, what will eventually occur. That's what he's trying to tell us. These natural disasters should call us to be mindful of these things. So we should never try to interpret the end is near when we see natural disasters. That is simply conjecture. People have endured for 2,000 years. Also wars and rumors of wars. You can imagine in most of our lifetimes that are going to be watching this, there was no World War I or World War II. Certainly, those were two wars in which more than half of the world was in some way impacted. And the toll was certainly that, there were a few places in the world that didn't feel some type of impact. And so we need to remember that, like, how would they have felt in those times? Remember what I was talking about last video. Eschatology and the interest in it was on the rise during those times because of those things. But we're not in those wars anymore. There's been a war going on throughout most of human history. And sometimes a large part of the world, or a large part of the civilized world at least. Today is no different. History bears reliable witness to these things. Sometimes we betray kind of a small view of the world and the time in which the world has existed by trying to interpret too much by something that happens within the context of our space and time. And we should avoid that if we can help that. Jesus says here, these things are simply a foreshadow, not even the birth pains. So he continues in verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all the nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to the nations, and then the end will come. So let's look at how Jesus uses this term. First of all, tribulation. Many have viewed this as a specific period of time referred to as the Great Tribulation, as it's become known. The word here, tribulation, is just translated from a Greek term that means distress, a time of great distress. Jesus not only uses it in the Olivet Discourse, but he uses it in a place like John 16:33, telling his disciples, in this world you will have various tribulations. And so take heart, I've overcome the world. Other places, the New Testament, it's used to describe general suffering that everybody will endure, sometimes general suffering that Christians endure, and sometimes persecution. So it's obviously a word that is broad. It can be very specific, and it probably is specific, but it is also very broad, so we need to watch that. He never says there's a great tribulation. He says tribulation will come, and he's already actually said that to his disciples by the time he says that here in a different context. Other places in the New Testament, of course, it is used in the same type of situation. Now, in terms of Jesus talking here, particularly about a specific great tribulation, he tells the disciples themselves that they will endure these things. He's not saying, hey, if you're living at the end of times, you will endure these things. He tells his disciples that he's speaking to right there in that context, you will endure these things. Remember that. We have to interpret it that way. It had to mean something to them, and it did. And they did endure these things. They were given up, all of them, to death for the sake of Christ, except, say, probably John. And so they knew what this meant because they lived it very much as Jesus said. In fact, most of them had been killed by the time that the temple was destroyed. And so we see John as the long living one, living up into probably early 90s, but that was not the case for most of them. Most of them died between 40 and 70 AD. So there is that to remember. So we see the Olivet Discourse, and we automatically go to sometime at the end. He's talking to people who endured that tribulation already, right there in the first century, and within a few years of when he actually said this. We also need to remember that it's been the case throughout church history. Persecution has been common throughout church history from time to time, sometimes more universal type persecution, most of the time more localized persecution though. And today there's more persecution than any time in history. Now we do need to realize that that could be an indication that things seem to be amping up, that maybe this is a time of more tribulation and might be pointing to some more specific time, or it could just be cyclical, because just like the times of natural disaster, times of persecution do tend to be cyclical throughout church history. Christians have endured times of religious domination, even throughout religious history, and times of being the religious minority, though they have flip-flopped back and forth in that. So that has also been cyclical. Many have turned away from the faith. That has been the case all throughout church history. Some to betray one another. That's the reality of these things. In fact, we see John himself saying these things are occurring when he is writing 1st and 2nd John. We see that in 1 John chapter 2. Listen closely and tell me this doesn't sound like the Olivet Discourse. John chapter 2 verse 18, children, it is the last hour. Now, in that sense, to him, this was occurring. And so if John thinks that, he's writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, we know that we should not automatically just go to some special last time. Even to John the Apostle, writing under the inspiration of the Spirit, he understands that the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse, not in its fullness, but at least partially, is being played out right in his lifetime. He said, it is the last hour, as you've heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us because they were not of us, right? Jesus said they're going to go out from you and betray the brethren. But he says they went out from us, they were not of us. For if they'd been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out that it might be plain that they were not of us. But you have been annoyed by the Holy One, and you all have knowledge. And I write to you, not because you do not know the truth, but because you do know it, and because no lie is of the truth. Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ, and this is the Antichrist? Anyone who denies the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son as the Father. Whoever confesses the Son has the Father also. Going down to chapter 4, verse 1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit. Test the spirits. Jesus said, be careful they don't deceive you, right? This is what John's saying. Test the spirits to see whether they're from God, or for many prophets have already gone out into the world that were false. So he says that has already occurred. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses Jesus Christ has come in flesh is from God. Every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and now is in the world already. Little children, you are from God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is he who is greater than he who is in the world. They are from the world, therefore they speak from the world, and the world listens. We are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us. Whoever is not God does not listen. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. Whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. So here we see false prophets, betrayal going out from us that John is saying is occurring when he's writing that. And then 2 John, same thing. For many deceivers have already gone out into the world, those who confess the coming of Christ in the flesh, who do not confess that, such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. So lest we make Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, the Olivet Discourse, just about our time or about some special time at the end, John heard Jesus say this, understood it, writes that it is being fulfilled in his lifetime. These verses make something abundantly clear, that although it's possible that Jesus is warning about a particular type of short great tribulation in the future, it is clear that at least part of this it has been already fulfilled and is consistently being fulfilled through history, at least until that time. And so in the first century, we even see that happening. Back in Matthew 24, he goes on in verse 4, and the gospel will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, if you saw last week's video, I spoke briefly about this. The history of the Great Commission bears witness to something very clearly, and it's this: that the Great Commission was taken seriously by the apostles, it was taken seriously by the churches they planted, and it very much spread throughout the world. It has been through every continent of the world, not to every single people group, at least not in one generation. But that may very well never actually happen. The point of this is an evangelization of the world as we know it. And that is very difficult to do in one generation. In other words, I think people have always looked to this time and said, well, maybe if we just need to get all the people groups in so Jesus will come back. Well, it takes so long to do that. By that time, a whole generation has passed away. And then you have these people, which their forebears may have been evangelized, but they haven't been. So now you've got an unreached people group again. So it's unreasonable to think that he's talking about a time in which every single person on earth has heard the gospel. It is a lot more reasonable just in the context of what he said in the Olivet Discourse, that you're going to be hated, they're going to deliver you up, the nations will hate you because of the name of Christ and all the rest. I mean, in that context, it is very difficult to evangelize the world. It's always going to be that way. It is today. So it is probably more responsible to see this as just simply saying the Great Commission must be fulfilled for the most part. And it certainly, at least at this point, seems to be that right now Jesus could come back. None of these things needn't happen any more than they already have. We should be prepared. John thought that. Paul thought that. They looked for Christ now. They spoke of him in imminent return, and that's very clear. So we should do the same thing. Now, if we just take that, and then it says, and then the end will come. So the end didn't come until these things take place. And then what he's going to do is go back, he's going to go and retrofit some things, beginning in verse 15, which we'll pick that up next week. Okay, so I told you we wouldn't get through the Olivet Discourse. I could talk a long time about it. I have spent an enormous amount of time studying it, and I love it. It's fascinating to me. Honestly, I understand why people are freaks about eschatology, because it is fascinating. That is for sure. What we need to realize is we need to be doing what the disciples did, knowing that Christ's return is imminent, knowing that he meant everything that he said, knowing that tribulation's coming, and then live out the Great Commission, evangelizing the world. The end will come when he brings it about, and we will not know until that time. So, in general, here's some things we could be left with until next week. First of all, we should not make a common mistake, and that is forgetting the historical and contextual place from whence this text comes. If we do that, then we're looking for everything that Jesus said in some future time when he was talking to his disciples about what would happen to them. And then what would happen to the people they discipled, and then the people they discipled, and on and on and on. Until the end comes, we can look for these same things. We need to realize that. Second, we have to admit that at least in part, this Olivet Discourse has been and is being fulfilled. That doesn't mean a great tribulation isn't coming in some sort. It doesn't mean it is coming either. But great tribulation has come in spells and times. And again, like I said last week, persecuted Christians understand that very well. Americans have a really hard time with that. And if you want to know who believes in this great tribulation, or this time in which Christians are swept away and won't have to endure it, most of the people that actually believe that are in more comfortable cultures like ours. Other people who are enduring great persecution, they don't tend to believe that because they're already living it, and they're living in such vile circumstances that they can't imagine worse. And they're still faithful, and that's an encouragement actually for us. Third, we have to stop thinking about, I don't know, that just all of us, no matter what generation, no matter where we live, no matter how much we've learned, we all still are just people of time. We're men and women of our time. And so we have a very small box to think out of. We need to think about the large picture of God's kingdom and the eschaton. And when we do that, we all of a sudden realize we can leave behind some of this strange type of eschatology that's developed in the last 100 years, where we think we have to figure all this stuff out by specific fulfillments. That's a very strange thing in the course of church history. So finally, we have to study eschatology biblically and theologically. And here's what we can't do. If we do that, then what we're going to do is things like the Left Behind series, that ain't going to be anything to do with how we think about the eschatology that we believe, okay? We take those movies, the Nick Cage Left Behind movie, all that stuff, we put it away. Because that stuff is pop culture. That stuff is not very biblically and theologically robust. That stuff comes from a very strange, I guess, time. Like, 100 years from now, we may still have premillennial, pre-trib people, but they probably won't be thinking like that. I mean, that's very timed. And we will see that 20 years from now, believe you me, we will see how very encrunched and encapsulated in a time warp that thinking is. Our view of the kingdom has to be bigger than that. Our view of eschatology has to be bigger than that. And when it is, I think we will find that not only does it remain fascinating, but it remains fascinating on its own term. This stuff is good. It doesn't need help. It doesn't need to be fancified. It doesn't need for us to think we've got to have charts and maps to make it more interesting. There's nothing more fascinating than God and His kingdom. And so if we're not satisfied with that, then we're studying eschatology the wrong way. And I hope and pray we can get a little better at studying it after this study. So I'll pick up there next week, and we don't know right now, but we may be in person next week with systematic theology. If we will, we'll meet as usual in the fellowship hall. But we haven't announced that because we're not 100% sure yet. But our plans right now, at least, seem to be able to meet a week from Wednesday in the fellowship hall for systematic theology, where we'll pick this up. And I hope we can, because this needs a lot of discussion and it's a lot of fun. So hope to see you then. Thanks.